Three high school bullies thought they had found the perfect victim in their quiet substitute teacher. What they discovered in 45 seconds would leave them speechless and change everything they thought they knew about power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell stepped through the front entrance of Lincoln Valley High School at exactly 7:15 a.m., her worn leather messenger bag slung across her shoulder and a thermos of coffee in her hand. The October morning carried a crisp bite that reminded her of autumn days back in Vermont, though the sprawling California campus before her was nothing like the small-town schools of her childhood. At 28, Sarah possessed an understated presence that allowed her to blend seamlessly into crowds of quality that had served her well during her 3 years as a substitute teacher throughout the Sacramento area. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her simple outfit of dark slacks and a cream-colored blouse reflected the careful balance substitute teachers learned to strike, professional enough to command respect, but not so formal as to seem out of touch with the students. Sarah's green eyes held a quiet intelligence, and her movements carried a subtle grace that suggested physical awareness, though nothing about her appearance hinted at anything extraordinary. The hallways of Lincoln Valley buzzed with the familiar energy of a Thursday morning. Students clustered around lockers, sharing gossip and complaints about upcoming tests, while teachers hurried past with arms full of papers and coffee cups. Sarah made her way to the main office, navigating through the chaos with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to read school environments quickly and adapt accordingly. "Miss Mitchell," called Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, as Sarah approached the front desk. The older woman's face lit up with genuine pleasure, a reaction that had become increasingly common as Sarah built her reputation throughout the district. "We're so glad you could take Mrs. Garrett's classes today. She came down with that flu that's been going around." Sarah accepted the folder containing lesson plans and classroom keys, scanning the schedule that would define her day. 4 periods of sophomore English, 1 period of study hall, and lunch duty, a typical assignment that should have felt routine after 3 years of substitute work. What the paperwork didn't convey was the unique challenge that awaited her in 3rd period, where Mrs. Garrett's most difficult class had developed a reputation that preceded them throughout the school. Room 142 was located in the newer wing of Lincoln Valley High School, part of an expansion completed just 5 years earlier. The classroom featured modern smartboards, collaborative desk arrangements, and large windows that flooded the space with natural light. Sarah arrived 20 minutes before the first bell, using the time to familiarize herself with Mrs. Garrett's materials and understand the flow of the day's lessons. The bulletin boards displayed student work from recent poetry units, and the bookshelves contained an impressive collection of contemporary young adult literature alongside classic texts. Sarah could see that Mrs. Garrett was an experienced educator who cared deeply about engaging her students with relevant, challenging material. The classroom environment suggested high expectations and mutual respect, qualities that Sarah hoped would carry over during her temporary presence. Her first 2 periods proceeded smoothly, confirming her initial assessment of the positive classroom culture Mrs. Garrett had established. The freshman students in 1st period were eager to please and responded well to Sarah's gentle humor and clear instructions. 2nd period juniors demonstrated the kind of academic maturity that made teaching genuinely enjoyable, engaging thoughtfully with the day's discussion about character motivation in contemporary fiction. During her preparation period, Sarah reviewed the materials for the 3rd period with particular attention. Mrs. Garrett's notes included subtle warnings about certain students who required additional structure and clear boundaries. The lesson plan was more detailed than those for other periods, with specific suggestions for managing disruptions and maintaining academic focus. Sarah had encountered similar notes throughout her substitute career and understood that some classes simply required more strategic approaches than others. The warning bell for third period rang at 11:47 a.m., and Sarah positioned herself at the classroom door to greet students as they entered. This practice had become one of her most effective tools for establishing positive relationships, quickly making eye contact, using names when possible, and setting a welcoming but professional tone from the moment students crossed the threshold. Brandon Hayes entered first, his 6 feet 2 inches frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the classroom with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being noticed. His varsity jacket proclaimed his status as a member of Lincoln Valley's championship wrestling team, and his perfectly styled dark hair suggested someone who invested significant time in his appearance. Brandon's entrance was deliberately theatrical, designed to announce his presence and establish his importance to anyone who might have missed it. Close behind him came Stephanie Walsh, whose platinum blonde hair and designer clothing marked her as someone with both the means and the desire to project wealth and status. Her movements were calculated and precise, each gesture seeming choreographed for maximum impact. Stephanie's blue eyes surveyed the classroom with the kind of evaluative gaze that suggested she was constantly assessing social hierarchies and her position within them. The third member of their group, Derek Novak, followed with the eager energy of someone desperate to maintain his place in their inner circle. His nervous laughter and quick glances toward Brandon revealed his role as the enthusiastic follower, always ready to amplify whatever mood the group's leader set. Derek's smaller frame and less confident demeanor suggested that his association with Brandon and Stephanie was based more on his willingness to support their agenda than on any natural leadership qualities of his own. Sarah observed these dynamics with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read classroom social structures quickly. The way other students navigated around this trio, the subtle deference in their body language, and the careful distance maintained by most of their classmates told a clear story about power dynamics within the room. Several students entered with their heads down, moving directly to seats as far from the back corner as possible, while others seemed to position themselves where they could observe without being observed. Among the other 26 students in the class, Sarah noticed patterns that reinforced her initial assessment of the social landscape. Ashley Chun, a quiet student with dark-rimmed glasses, chose a seat in the front row and immediately began organizing her materials with the focused attention of someone trying to avoid unwanted notice. Her movements suggested intelligence and academic engagement, but also a wariness that spoke to previous negative experiences with classroom disruptions. Marcus Thompson, a tall student with kind eyes and worn sneakers, selected a middle seat, where he could maintain awareness of the room's dynamics while staying out of direct confrontation zones. His careful positioning and alert expression suggested someone who had learned to navigate challenging social situations through strategic awareness rather than direct confrontation. The contrast between these students and Brandon's group was immediately apparent. While most of the class prepared for learning by organizing notebooks and reviewing previous assignments, Brandon, Stephanie, and Derek engaged in loud conversations, clearly designed to establish their dominance over the classroom atmosphere. Their topics ranged from weekend social plans to complaints about other teachers, delivered at volumes that made private conversation impossible for nearby students. Sarah completed her mental mapping of the classroom dynamics and moved to the front of the room to begin the day's lesson. Mrs. Garrett had planned a discussion-based activity exploring themes in the short stories they had been reading, with small group work leading to a whole class analysis of different authors' approaches to character development. The lesson design was solid and age-appropriate, offering multiple opportunities for engagement while maintaining clear academic focus. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that experienced educators develop over time. "I'm Ms. Mitchell, and I'll be working with you today while Mrs. Garrett recovers from the flu." I've reviewed your recent work on short story analysis, and I'm impressed by the thoughtful insights you've been developing. Brandon's response was immediate and deliberate. He leaned back in his chair with exaggerated casualness and stage whispered. To Stephanie, "Great, another substitute who thinks she actually knows what we're doing." His comment was perfectly calibrated, loud enough for most of the class to hear and assess Sarah's response, but delivered in a way that could be dismissed as private conversation if challenged directly. Stephanie's contribution built on Brandon's foundation with surgical precision. "I wonder if she's actually qualified to teach English," she said with the kind of false concern that made her intent unmistakably clear. Some substitutes just read from the lesson plans without really understanding the material. Sarah had encountered this exact pattern dozens of times throughout her substitute career. The testing phase typically began with comments designed to undermine her authority while maintaining plausible deniability. Her response would set the tone for the entire period and likely influence the students' behavior during any future interactions. She had learned that addressing such challenges required a delicate balance between firmness and grace, authority and approachability. "I appreciate your concern about educational quality," Sarah replied evenly, making brief eye contact with both Brandon and Stephanie while maintaining her welcoming expression. "Mrs. Garrett has left detailed notes about your class's high standards and intellectual curiosity. I'm looking forward to seeing that in action today." Her response acknowledged their challenge without taking the bait, redirected their energy toward positive expectations, and established that she was neither intimidated nor interested in power struggles. Several students glanced up with expressions that suggested they were impressed by Sarah's composure, while others seemed relieved that the potential confrontation had been diffused rather than escalated. Derek, apparently feeling that his contribution to the group dynamic was overdue, began making elaborate preparations for note-taking that involved repeatedly dropping his pen and making exaggerated efforts to retrieve it. Each incident created a small disruption that broke the flow of instruction, while appearing to be accidental clumsiness rather than deliberate sabotage. Sarah incorporated Derek's disruptions into her lesson flow by pausing briefly during each incident, making eye contact with him, and continuing when he was ready. This approach acknowledged his behavior without rewarding it with the negative attention he seemed to be seeking, while demonstrating to the rest of the class that learning would continue regardless of attempted distractions. As the period progressed, Sarah began to understand the specific dynamics that had prompted Mrs. Garrett's detailed warnings. Brandon, Stephanie, and Derek had developed a sophisticated system for disrupting classroom activities while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid serious consequences. Their tactics were subtle enough to frustrate teachers, but difficult to address through traditional disciplinary channels. What concerned Sarah most was the impact their behavior had on other students' ability to engage with the academic content. Ashley Chun repeatedly glanced nervously toward the back corner whenever Brandon's group became active, suggesting that she had experienced escalations in the past that had made learning uncomfortable or impossible. Marcus Thompson's careful positioning and alert body language indicated that he was expending significant mental energy monitoring potential threats rather than focusing on the literature discussion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The classroom environment that Mrs. Garrett had worked to establish, one of intellectual curiosity and respectful dialogue, was being systematically undermined by 3 students who seemed to view disruption as entertainment and substitute teachers as particularly appealing targets for their harassment. Sarah recognized that she was facing more than typical teenage testing of boundaries. The sophisticated nature of the challenges, the coordinated approach among the 3 students, and the obvious anxiety displayed by their classmates suggested a pattern of behavior that had been developing over time. as she prepared to transition into the small group activity that would occupy the remainder of the period. Sarah wondered how many other substitute teachers had struggled with this same dynamic and what strategies might prove effective for maintaining the learning environment that all students deserved. What the student files at Lincoln Valley High School didn't contain was any reference to Sarah Mitchell's previous life before teaching became her chosen path. The administrative records showed her teaching credentials, positive references from other schools, and a clean background check, but they remained silent about the decade she had spent in an entirely different world, one where physical confrontation was not something to be avoided, but rather a skill to be mastered and perfected. Sarah's journey into martial arts had begun during her sophomore year at the University of Vermont, though the roots traced back even further to a childhood shaped by circumstances that demanded resilience. Growing up in a small town outside Burlington, she had been raised by her grandmother, Margaret Mitchell, after her parents died in a car accident when Sarah was 7 years old. Margaret was a woman of quiet strength who had survived the Great Depression, raised 5 children as a single mother, and possessed an unwavering belief that true power came from discipline, not aggression. The decision to enroll in a Krav Maga class during college had been practical rather than philosophical. Sarah's part-time job at a downtown bookstore required her to walk alone through poorly lit streets after closing time, and several recent incidents involving female students had prompted the university to offer self-defense workshops. What she expected to be a basic safety course became something much more significant when she discovered an aptitude that surprised both her instructors and herself. Krav Maga, developed by the Israeli military, was not a traditional martial art focused on spiritual development or sporting competition. It was a combat system designed for real-world confrontations, emphasizing aggressive counterattacks, situational awareness, and the psychological preparedness to act decisively under extreme stress. The training was intense, demanding, and completely unlike anything Sarah had previously experienced, but she found herself drawn to its practical philosophy and no-nonsense approach to personal protection. Her first instructor, David Stern, was a former Israeli Defense Forces combat trainer who had immigrated to the United States and established a small but highly respected training center near the university campus. David's approach to instruction was methodical and demanding, requiring students to demonstrate not only physical techniques, but also the mental discipline necessary to apply them appropriately. He emphasized that the greatest skill was knowing when not to fight, and that true mastery meant having the confidence to de-escalate situations through presence and composure rather than physical force. Under David's guidance, Sarah progressed rapidly through the foundational levels of Krav Maga training. Her background as a competitive swimmer in high school had given her excellent body awareness and cardiovascular conditioning, while her naturally analytical mind helped her understand the biomechanics behind each technique. More importantly, she developed the kind of situational awareness that became second nature, the ability to assess environments, identify potential threats, and position herself strategically without conscious effort. The training regimen was grueling and comprehensive. 3 evenings per week, Sarah spent 2 hours learning techniques for defending against various forms of attack grabs, chokes, strikes, and weapons. The system's emphasis on using an attacker's momentum and aggression against them appealed to her analytical nature, while the psychological components of training helped her develop an unshakable calmness under pressure that would prove invaluable in unexpected situations. As Sarah advanced through intermediate and expert levels, her training expanded beyond pure self-defense into areas that few civilians ever explored. David recognized her exceptional aptitude and invited her to join an advanced group that included former military personnel, law enforcement officers, and security professionals. This elite circle trained in techniques designed for protecting others, crowd control, and non-lethal neutralization of multiple attackers, skills that went far beyond personal protection into the realm of professional security work. The advanced training sessions were conducted with military precision and intensity. Students learned to assess group dynamics and identify primary threats within seconds, to move through chaotic environments while maintaining tactical awareness, and to apply precisely controlled force that could neutralize aggressive behavior without causing permanent injury. Sarah excelled in these scenarios, demonstrating not only technical proficiency, but also the psychological composure necessary to make split-second decisions about appropriate responses to varying levels of threat. Her senior year, David offered Sarah an opportunity that would have changed her entire career trajectory. A private security firm specializing in executive protection was seeking candidates with her unique combination of skills: advanced combat training, psychological composure, and the kind of professional demeanor that would allow them to blend into corporate environments while providing discreet protection for high-profile clients. The position offered excellent compensation, extensive travel, and the chance to work with some of the most skilled security professionals in the industry. Sarah seriously considered the offer, spending weeks weighing the appeal of a career that would utilize her most developed skills against her growing interest in education and working with young people. Her decision to decline came during a volunteer tutoring session at a local high school, where she encountered a student whose academic struggles masked significant potential. The satisfaction she felt in helping him overcome his challenges and discover his own capabilities convinced her that her future lay in education rather than security work. The transition from intensive combat training to substitute teaching required a complete philosophical shift that challenged Sarah in unexpected ways. After years of training to respond to threats with decisive action, she had to learn to address conflict through patience, understanding, and institutional procedures. The techniques that had become instinctive responses had to be consciously suppressed in favor of approaches appropriate for educational environments. Margaret's influence proved crucial during this transition period. Her grandmother's wisdom about the difference between strength and aggression, between protecting others and seeking dominance, provided the philosophical framework that allowed Sarah to integrate her combat skills with her chosen profession. Margaret had always taught that true strength was demonstrated through restraint, that the most powerful people were those who never needed to prove their power to others. Sarah maintained her training throughout her teaching career, though she modified her practice to focus more on fitness and mental discipline than combat readiness. She continued attending workshops and seminars to keep her skills current, but she approached them as forms of personal development rather than preparation for professional application. The confidence and awareness she had developed through years of training remained constant companions, affecting how she moved through the world and how she assessed situations, even when those situations involved nothing more threatening than classroom management challenges. The psychological aspects of her training proved particularly valuable in educational settings. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, to assess group dynamics quickly, and to project quiet authority without aggression served her well in managing diverse classroom environments. Students often commented on her unusually composed demeanor during stressful situations, though none suspected the source of that unflappable confidence. Sarah's commitment to nonviolence in educational context was absolute and intentional. She had witnessed too many situations where authority figures had escalated minor conflicts into major confrontations through poor judgment or inability to control their own reactions. Her training had taught her that the greatest skill was knowing when not to fight, and she applied this principle rigorously to her teaching philosophy. The irony was not lost on her that she spent her days surrounded by the kind of social dynamics and power struggles that her advanced training had prepared her to handle through entirely different means. High school environments could be remarkably similar to other settings where group psychology, intimidation tactics, and social hierarchies created potentially volatile situations. The difference was that her role as an educator required her to address these dynamics through institutional channels and therapeutic approaches rather than direct intervention. Her evening routine still included physical training, though it was modified for maintenance rather than advancement. She practiced forms alone in her apartment, focusing on the meditative aspects of movement and the mental discipline that had originally drawn her to martial arts. These sessions served as stress relief and helped her maintain the physical conditioning that contributed to her confident bearing, even though she had no intention of ever using these skills in a professional context. Sarah's personal relationships had been complicated by her unique background. Dating had proven challenging when potential partners learned about her combat training, with reactions ranging from intimidation to fetishization, both of which missed the point entirely. She had learned to be selective about sharing this aspect of her history, revealing it only to people who could understand it as one facet of a complex personality, rather than as a defining characteristic. Her decision to move to California had been motivated partly by a desire for a fresh start in an environment where no one knew about her previous training or the opportunities she had declined in favor of education. The substitute teaching work allowed her to explore different school environments while building toward a permanent position, and the anonymity of temporary assignments meant that she could focus entirely on educational effectiveness without the complications that sometimes arose when people learned about her background. As Sarah stood in room 142 at Lincoln Valley High School, watching Brandon Hayes test the boundaries of appropriate classroom behavior, she felt the familiar sensation of heightened awareness that years of training had ingrained in her nervous system. Her ability to assess the group dynamics, identify the primary instigator, and anticipate potential escalation patterns was automatic and effortless. What required conscious effort was maintaining her commitment to educational approaches when every instinct developed through a decade of training suggested more direct and efficient solutions. The students in her third period class had no way of knowing that their quiet substitute teacher could have ended Brandon's disruptions in seconds, or that her patient responses to their challenges represented a choice rather than an inability to respond more decisively. Sarah's true strength lay not in her physical capabilities, but in her commitment to using those capabilities appropriately, reserving them for situations where protection rather than education was the primary concern. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as she prepared to continue the lesson. The strongest people are those who never need to prove their strength. Sarah had built her entire teaching philosophy around this principle, and she intended to honor it regardless of how far Brandon and his associates might push their testing of her resolve. Brandon Hayes had ruled Lincoln Valley High School's social hierarchy for 3 years, building his empire through a combination of athletic prowess, family connections, and an intuitive understanding of how to manipulate institutional systems to his advantage. His dominance wasn't accidental, it was the product of careful cultivation and strategic positioning that had made him virtually untouchable within the school's existing power structure. The foundation of Brandon's influence traced back to his father, Robert Hayes, who owned the largest construction company in the Sacramento Valley and had built half the commercial developments in Lincoln Valley over the past 2 decades. Robert's company had constructed the newer wing of the high school, donated generously to athletic programs, and maintained contracts for ongoing maintenance throughout the district. This financial relationship created a web of obligations and dependencies that extended Brandon's protection far beyond what his wrestling achievements alone could have provided. Robert Hayes served on the school board and had cultivated relationships with administrators, coaches, and influential parents that created an informal network of people invested in Brandon's success. When Brandon faced potential consequences for behavioral issues, phone calls were made, meetings were arranged, and solutions were found that protected his academic and athletic standing. The system wasn't corrupt in any dramatic sense. It was simply structured in ways that made Brandon's problems everyone else's problems to solve. Brandon had learned to exploit these advantages with sophisticated understanding of how institutional politics functioned. He knew exactly how far he could push boundaries before triggering responses that even his father's influence couldn't neutralize. And he had developed techniques for targeting people who lacked similar protection networks. Substitute teachers represented perfect victims because they had no established relationships, no institutional advocates, and no long-term presence that would make their mistreatment a lasting concern for administrators focused on managing permanent faculty and community relationships. His academic record reflected this strategic approach to consequences. Brandon maintained just enough academic performance to remain eligible for wrestling, but his grades were consistently achieved through negotiated extra credit assignments, extended deadlines, and grading curves that seemed to apply more generously to him than to other students. Teachers learned that failing Brandon meant dealing with pressure from administrators who preferred avoiding conflicts with influential families, and most found it easier to create alternative paths to acceptable grades than to engage in battles. They were unlikely to win. The wrestling program had amplified Brandon's status throughout the school, but not because of exceptional athletic achievement. While he was genuinely skilled and had helped the team achieve regional success, his value to the program extended beyond his individual performance. His father's financial support had upgraded facilities, funded equipment purchases, and provided resources that elevated the entire athletic department. Coach Martinez understood that maintaining Robert Hayes' support meant ensuring Brandon's satisfaction with his high school experience, creating another layer of institutional investment in protecting Brandon from consequences. Brandon's social media presence reflected his careful cultivation of image and influence. His Instagram account featured professionally shot photos from wrestling tournaments, expensive vacations, and exclusive social events that reinforced his status as someone with access to experiences beyond most teenagers' reach. He had mastered the art of humble bragging, presenting his advantages as natural outcomes of hard work, while subtly emphasizing the lifestyle differences that separated him from less privileged classmates. More importantly, Brandon had weaponized social media as a tool for maintaining social control within the school. Students who challenged his authority found themselves excluded from social events, targeted with coordinated harassment campaigns, and subjected to public humiliation that extended far beyond school hours. His ability to influence other students' social standing created a climate where most people found cooperation preferable to resistance, even when they privately disapproved of his behavior. Stephanie Walsh had aligned herself with Brandon not from romantic attraction, but from calculated recognition that their combined influence created opportunities neither could achieve independently. Her family's wealth came from different sources. Her father owned several luxury car dealerships throughout Northern California, but it provided similar advantages in terms of resources, connections, and institutional leverage. The Walsh family's annual donations to school fundraisers were legendary, and Stephanie had learned to leverage this generosity into social capital that protected her from accountability. Stephanie's role in their partnership was more subtle but equally destructive than Brandon's direct approach. While Brandon relied on intimidation and social pressure, Stephanie specialized in psychological manipulation and reputation destruction. She had an uncanny ability to identify people's insecurities and exploit them through carefully crafted comments that appeared supportive while delivering devastating blows to self-confidence. Her attacks were surgical in their precision, designed to leave victims questioning their own perceptions rather than recognizing deliberate cruelty. Her influence over other female students was particularly pronounced. Stephanie had created an informal hierarchy among girls that determined social acceptance, dating opportunities, and inclusion in desirable activities. Students who pleased her found themselves invited to exclusive gatherings and connected with popular social circles, while those who displeased her faced systematic exclusion that could make their high school experience miserable. This power structure meant that most girls at Lincoln Valley either sought Stephanie's approval or feared her disapproval, creating an atmosphere where challenging her authority seemed impossibly risky. Stephanie's academic performance was maintained through different but equally problematic means than Brandon's grade manipulation. She had perfected the art of identifying and befriending academically gifted students who could be convinced to share homework, provide tutoring, or collaborate on assignments in ways that gave her credit for work she hadn't actually completed. Her charm and social status made these arrangements seem like mutually beneficial friendships rather than exploitative relationships, and her victims often remained unaware of how thoroughly they were being used. Derek Novak's position in their group was more precarious but equally motivated by calculated self-interest. Coming from a middle-class family without significant wealth or influence, Derek had achieved his association with Brandon and Stephanie through relentless dedication to supporting their agenda and making himself indispensable to their social operations. His role was that of the enthusiastic enforcer, willing to take risks and absorb consequences that his more protected associates preferred to avoid. Derek's family background created insecurities that made his association with Brandon and Stephanie psychologically essential to his self-image. His father worked as a middle manager at an insurance company, and his mother taught elementary school, respectable professions that provided a comfortable lifestyle, but nothing approaching the wealth and status that Brandon and Stephanie took for granted. Derek's designer clothing and expensive accessories were purchased through part-time work and careful saving, representing sacrifices that his friends could afford without thought. His desperation to maintain his position within their inner circle made Derek the most dangerous member of their group in many ways. While Brandon and Stephanie could afford to be strategic about their harassment campaigns, Derek felt constant pressure to prove his value through increasingly aggressive behavior. He was willing to take actions that even Brandon might consider too risky, and his fear of social exile made him susceptible to manipulation that could escalate situations beyond what anyone had originally intended. The trio's targeting of substitute teachers had evolved into a refined system over the course of their high school careers. They had learned that temporary instructors represented ideal victims because they lacked the relationships and institutional knowledge necessary to mount effective responses to sophisticated harassment campaigns. Substitute teachers were isolated, vulnerable, and typically gone within days, making them perfect outlets for entertainment that carried minimal risk of meaningful consequences. Their methods had been tested and refined through encounters with dozens of substitute teachers over the past 3 years. They knew which techniques would frustrate educators without crossing lines that would trigger administrative intervention, how to coordinate their efforts for maximum impact while maintaining plausible deniability, and how to identify substitutes who were most likely to struggle with classroom management challenges. The system was cruel, effective, and had become so routine that they approached new substitute teachers as opportunities for entertainment rather than as professional educators deserving of respect. The school's administration was aware of these patterns but had proven ineffective at addressing them through traditional disciplinary approaches. Principal Stevens had implemented various policies and consequences over the years, but Brandon's group had adapted their tactics to work within whatever constraints were established. When direct confrontation was discouraged, they shifted to passive-aggressive undermining. When classroom disruption became problematic, they moved their harassment into hallways and social media. When individual consequences became serious, they distributed responsibility among larger groups of participants. Faculty members had developed various strategies for dealing with Brandon, Stephanie, and Derek, ranging from appeasement to avoidance. Some teachers had learned to manage them through special privileges and reduced expectations, essentially negotiating peace treaties that allowed classroom instruction to continue in exchange for overlooking behavior that would be unacceptable from other students. Others had requested schedule changes to avoid having them in classes, creating an informal system where the most challenging students were concentrated among teachers willing or forced to deal with them. The impact on school culture extended far beyond their immediate victims. Other students had learned to navigate around their influence, creating social dynamics where fear and calculation replaced authentic relationships and genuine academic engagement. Teachers spent disproportionate amounts of time and energy managing conflicts created by their behavior, reducing the attention and resources available for supporting students who genuinely wanted to learn and grow. Lincoln Valley High School had become a case study in how concentrated social toxicity could undermine institutional effectiveness when systems weren't designed to address sophisticated manipulation by influential actors. The school's positive reputation and academic and athletic achievements masked underlying problems that affected daily experiences for hundreds of students and dozens of faculty members who had learned to accommodate rather than confront the destructive dynamics that Brandon, Stephanie, and Derek had created. As Sarah Mitchell stood before her third period class, she was facing not just 3 problematic teenagers, but an entire ecosystem of enabling relationships, institutional failures, and cultural norms that had evolved to protect their behavior while leaving their victims isolated and vulnerable. The challenge she represented to their established patterns would test every aspect of the power structure they had spent years building, and their response would reveal just how far they were willing to go to maintain their dominance over Lincoln Valley's social hierarchy. The remainder of Thursday's third period had concluded without major incident, but Sarah sensed an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested Brandon's group was merely gathering intelligence rather than accepting defeat. As students filed out of room 142, she noticed the trio lingering near the doorway, their hushed conversation and occasional glances in her direction confirming that her composed responses had only heightened their interest in testing her limits. Further, Friday morning brought the first clear indication that their harassment campaign had moved beyond spontaneous classroom disruption into premeditated psychological warfare. Sarah arrived at Lincoln Valley High School to discover her assigned parking space marked with chalk outlines that formed crude drawings, accompanied by messages questioning her competence and suggesting she should find employment more suited to her abilities. The artwork was sophisticated enough to avoid crossing into clearly actionable territory while unmistakably targeting her. Personally, the precision of the harassment revealed careful planning and coordination. Someone had arrived early enough to create the chalk display, while avoiding detection by custodial staff or early arriving faculty members. The messages were crafted to humiliate without technically violating school policies about threatening language, demonstrating familiarity with administrative boundaries and legal constraints. Most significantly, the chalk medium ensured that evidence would disappear with the first rainfall or custodial cleaning, making formal complaints difficult to substantiate. Sarah spent 15 minutes erasing the markings while other teachers arrived for their morning duties. Several colleagues noticed her activity but offered no assistance or acknowledgement, suggesting either ignorance about the situation's significance or deliberate avoidance of involvement in conflicts that might prove professionally complicated. The isolation was deliberate and effective, reinforcing the message that she could expect no institutional support for challenges that couldn't be definitively proven or directly witnessed by administrators. During her first period, Sarah received a text message from an unknown number containing a photograph of herself walking across the parking lot, accompanied by commentary about her appearance and suggestions about her personal life that crossed into sexual harassment territory. The timing of the message sent while she was actively teaching demonstrated that multiple people were involved in coordinating the harassment campaign, and that they possessed enough technological sophistication to maintain surveillance while avoiding detection. The photograph's angle and quality suggested it had been taken from inside the school building, meaning that students were using class time to organize harassment activities. More concerning was the implication that her movements were being monitored and documented, creating a level of psychological pressure that extended far beyond classroom management challenges into personal safety concerns. The anonymous nature of the communication made direct response impossible while ensuring that the intimidation achieved its intended effect. Second period brought an escalation in classroom-based harassment that revealed new dimensions of their tactical approach. Brandon had apparently recruited additional participants for disruption activities, expanding their operation beyond the core trio to include students whose involvement provided better cover for coordinated misbehavior. Rather than obvious confrontation, they employed a strategy of death by 1,000 cuts, constant low-level disruptions that individually seemed minor, but collectively made effective instruction impossible. The expanded group had developed a rotation system where different students took turns creating small disruptions throughout the period. Someone would drop textbooks at carefully timed intervals, others would engage in loud whispering during instructional moments, and several would make frequent requests for bathroom passes that broke the flow of academic discussion. Each individual incident was minor enough to seem accidental or reasonable, but their coordination created an atmosphere of chaos that prevented genuine learning for everyone in the classroom. Sarah recognized the sophistication of their approach and adapted her instruction accordingly, shifting from discussion-based activities to independent work that would be less vulnerable to group disruption tactics. However, this defensive adjustment represented a victory for the harassment campaign. By forcing her to abandon more engaging teaching methods in favor of approaches that simply minimized opportunities for sabotage, the students who genuinely wanted to learn were being deprived of quality instruction because their classmates had weaponized the classroom environment. Ashley Chun's visible distress during these incidents confirmed that the harassment was affecting more than just its primary target. The quiet student repeatedly glanced towards Sarah with expressions that seemed apologetic, as if she wanted to intervene but felt powerless to challenge the group dynamics. Several other students showed similar signs of discomfort, shifting uneasily in their seats and avoiding eye contact when disruptions occurred, suggesting that Brandon's influence was maintained through intimidation rather than genuine popularity. Lunch period brought a new arena for harassment as Sarah crossed the cafeteria to reach the faculty workroom. Brandon's expanded group had positioned themselves strategically throughout the space, creating a gauntlet of coordinated mockery disguised as casual conversation. As she passed each table, students would make loud comments about substitute teachers, express exaggerated sympathy for classes stuck with temporary instructors, or engage in theatrical discussions about the qualifications required for real teaching. Positions. The cafeteria harassment was particularly insidious because it occurred in a public space where dozens of students and several faculty members could witness the coordinated humiliation. However, the comments were delivered as seemingly innocent conversations among friends rather than direct confrontations, making intervention difficult without appearing to overreact to normal student discussion. The public nature of the humiliation amplified its psychological impact while providing perfect cover for the perpetrators. Stephanie's contribution to the lunch harassment demonstrated her particular talent for psychological manipulation. She initiated conversations with other students that were clearly designed for Sarah to overhear, expressing concern about whether substitute teachers received adequate training and wondering aloud whether the district's hiring standards were sufficiently rigorous. Her tone conveyed helpful concern rather than malicious intent, making her comments appear thoughtful rather than cruel to casual observers. Derek's role in the cafeteria campaign involved recruiting students from outside Brandon's immediate circle. to participate in the harassment without fully understanding its coordinated nature. He moved between tables, encouraging various groups to share stories about substitute teacher experiences, creating the impression of spontaneous discussion while actually orchestrating a broader campaign of professional undermining. His enthusiasm for the activity revealed how much he enjoyed wielding social influence, even when that influence was derived entirely from his association with more powerful figures. The afternoon brought technological escalation as Sarah discovered that someone had created fake social media accounts using her name and photograph. The accounts contained fabricated information about her qualifications, personal life, and professional history designed to damage her reputation among students, parents, and potential employers. The creation of false profiles represented a significant investment of time and effort, confirming that the harassment had evolved beyond spontaneous teenage mischief into a sustained campaign with serious potential consequences. The fake accounts were sophisticated enough to appear legitimate to casual observers, incorporating genuine details about her education and employment history mixed with fabricated information designed to raise questions about her competence and character. Someone had invested considerable research effort into gathering accurate biographical information, suggesting access to personnel records or other confidential sources that elevated the harassment beyond what typical students could achieve independently. More troubling was the discovery that the fake accounts had begun following and interacting with actual Lincoln Valley High School students, faculty members, and community organizations. The perpetrators were actively working to establish the false profiles within legitimate social networks where they could spread disinformation and damage Sarah's professional reputation in ways that would persist long after her temporary assignment ended. This level of sophistication suggested adult involvement or guidance that made the harassment campaign far more serious than typical student misbehavior. Sarah's third period class on Friday revealed new dimensions of psychological pressure as Brandon's group introduced elements of sexual harassment that crossed clear boundaries, while remaining difficult to address through traditional disciplinary channels. Their comments about her appearance became more frequent and specific, delivered in voices just loud enough for nearby students to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability about their intended audience. The sexual harassment was carefully calibrated to create maximum discomfort without providing clear grounds for administrative intervention. Brandon would make observations about Sarah's clothing choices that seemed to question their appropriateness for a school environment, while Stephanie would engage in stage whispers about whether certain styles were suitable for someone in an educational role. Derek contributed by asking elaborate questions about dress codes and professional standards that appeared innocent but were clearly designed to draw attention to Sarah's physical appearance. The psychological impact of this escalation was immediate and profound. Sarah found herself second-guessing clothing choices that had never been problematic in other educational settings, wondering whether her professional attire was somehow inappropriate or whether she was inadvertently contributing to the harassment by failing to anticipate how her appearance might be weaponized against her. This self-doubt represented exactly the kind of psychological victory that sophisticated harassment campaigns were designed to achieve. Other students' reactions to the sexual harassment revealed the broader damage being done to classroom culture. Several female students appeared visibly uncomfortable when Brandon's group made comments about Sarah's appearance, apparently recognizing that similar scrutiny could easily be directed toward them. Male students seemed uncertain about whether they were expected to participate in or challenge the inappropriate behavior, creating an atmosphere of tension that made normal social interaction difficult for everyone present. The escalation reached a new level when Brandon began making comments that suggested he had been gathering personal information about Sarah's life outside school. He made references to her apartment complex, her evening activities, and her weekend routines that demonstrated surveillance beyond what could be explained by casual observation during school hours. The implied stalking created genuine safety concerns that extended far beyond professional harassment into potential criminal behavior. Sarah recognized that the situation had moved well beyond typical classroom management challenges into territory that might require law enforcement intervention. However, the careful construction of the harassment campaign made pursuing formal remedies extremely difficult. Each individual incident could be dismissed as minor misbehavior or explained away through alternative interpretations. While the cumulative effect was clearly designed to drive her away from Lincoln Valley High School through systematic psychological intimidation, the sophistication of their operation suggested that Brandon's group had successfully employed similar tactics against other substitute teachers, refining their approach through experience and developing techniques that maximized psychological impact while minimizing risk of meaningful consequences. Their confidence in pushing boundaries indicated that they had never faced serious accountability for previous harassment campaigns, making them increasingly bold in their current targeting of Sarah. As Friday afternoon approached, Sarah realized that traditional educational responses to their behavior had proven completely inadequate. Her professional training emphasized de-escalation, patience, and working within institutional frameworks. But these approaches were designed for typical student misconduct rather than coordinated harassment campaigns, organized by sophisticated manipulators with extensive protection networks. The escalating nature of their attack suggested that Brandon's group viewed her restraint as weakness rather than professionalism, encouraging them to push even further beyond acceptable boundaries. The week's events had demonstrated that Lincoln Valley High School's existing systems were either unable or unwilling to address the kind of systematic harassment that Brandon, Stephanie, and Derek had perfected. Sarah faced a choice between accepting continued escalation of their psychological warfare or finding alternative approaches that her educational training had never anticipated she would need to employ in a classroom setting. Monday morning arrived with an ominous atmosphere that Sarah could sense the moment she entered Lincoln Valley High School. The weekend had provided no respite from the harassment campaign. Anonymous messages had continued throughout Saturday and Sunday. Fake social media accounts had proliferated across multiple platforms, and someone had even left threatening notes under her apartment door. The escalation had crossed into her personal life in ways that made clear this was no longer about classroom dynamics, but had become a comprehensive assault on her sense of safety and professional dignity. The administrative response to Sarah's formal complaints had been predictably inadequate. Principal Stevens had scheduled a brief meeting Friday afternoon where he listened to her concerns with apparent sympathy but offered only vague assurances about addressing the situation through appropriate channels. His suggestion that she try to build better rapport with the challenging students revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what she was facing, treating systematic harassment as a classroom management problem that could be solved through improved teaching techniques. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, had been more direct in her assessment of the situation. During a private conversation after Sarah's meeting with Principal Stevens, she had warned that previous substitute teachers had faced similar challenges with Brandon's group, and that most had simply requested reassignment rather than continuing to fight battles they couldn't win. Her advice to keep your head down and get through the week reflected the institutional culture that had allowed the harassment to flourish. By treating it as an inevitable occupational hazard rather than unacceptable criminal behavior, Sarah's weekend had been spent researching legal options and consulting with former colleagues about strategies for dealing with systematic workplace harassment. The responses had been universally frustrating. Employment lawyers explained that substitute teachers had limited protections compared to permanent faculty. Civil rights attorneys noted that proving coordinated harassment by minors presented significant evidential challenges, and law enforcement officials indicated that much of the behavior fell into gray areas that were difficult to prosecute without clear threats of physical violence. The isolation was deliberate and comprehensive. Sarah realized that Brandon's group had successfully created a situation where traditional support systems were either unwilling or unable to provide meaningful assistance. The school administration was compromised by political relationships. With influential families, law enforcement was constrained by the legal complexities of prosecuting juvenile harassment. And her professional colleagues were too concerned about their own job security to risk involvement in controversial conflicts. Monday's first period proceeded normally, but Sarah noticed increased surveillance from students who weren't typically part of Brandon's operations. Several teenagers positioned themselves in hallways where they could observe her movements between classes. Others lingered near her assigned parking space during arrival and departure times, and some had begun following her activities on social media with fake accounts designed to gather intelligence about her personal life. The expansion of surveillance suggested that the harassment campaign was entering a new phase with broader participation and more sophisticated coordination. The technological harassment had intensified over the weekend with the creation of additional fake profiles across multiple social media platforms. Someone had invested considerable time and effort into making these accounts appear legitimate, complete with fabricated histories, stolen photographs, and convincing biographical details. The fake profiles were being used to spread disinformation about Sarah's qualifications, personal life, and professional conduct to students, parents, faculty members, and potential employers throughout the educational community. More concerning was evidence that the fake accounts were being used to initiate contact with Sarah's actual friends, family members, and professional references. Her sister in Vermont had received friend requests from profiles claiming to be Sarah but containing information designed to damage her reputation among people who actually knew her. Former colleagues had been sent messages warning them about Sarah's alleged professional misconduct, while her university professors had received communications questioning the accuracy of the recommendations they had provided for her teaching. Certification. The systematic nature of the reputation destruction campaign revealed a level of organization and malicious intent that went far beyond typical teenage harassment. Someone was investing significant time and resources into ensuring that the damage to Sarah's professional standing would persist long after her temporary assignment at Lincoln Valley High School ended. The sophistication of the operation suggested adult guidance or participation, making it clear that she was facing more than just problematic students. Second period brought the introduction of physical intimidation tactics that marked a dangerous escalation in the harassment campaign. As Sarah walked through the hallway between classes, she found herself surrounded by a group of students who weren't part of Brandon's core circle but had apparently been recruited for this specific operation. They matched her pace while maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct physical contact, creating a moving barrier that prevented her from reaching her destination efficiently while making their intimidation tactics appear coincidental. To casual observers, the hallway intimidation was carefully choreographed to maximize psychological impact while avoiding actions that would trigger immediate administrative intervention. The recruited students engaged in loud conversations about violence against teachers, shared stories about substitute instructors who had been driven away from various schools, and made veiled references to what might happen to educators who failed to understand their place in the social hierarchy. Their comments were delivered as seemingly casual conversation among friends rather than direct threats, maintaining plausible deniability while creating an atmosphere of menace. Derek's role in coordinating the hallway intimidation revealed his growing importance to the harassment campaign. His desperate need to prove his value to Brandon and Stephanie had made him willing to take increasingly serious risks, and his middle-class background made him feel he had more to lose than his wealthier associates if the operation failed. This combination of motivation and vulnerability made him the most unpredictable member of their group, likely to escalate situations beyond what even Brandon might consider prudent. The physical intimidation extended into Sarah's classroom during the second period when several students who weren't enrolled in the class appeared at her doorway and lingered there throughout the instructional period. Their presence was explained as waiting to speak with enrolled students about various social plans, but their timing and positioning were clearly designed to create an atmosphere of surveillance and potential threat. The unauthorized presence of non-enrolled students violated school policies, but addressing it would require administrative intervention that Sarah had already learned to expect would be ineffective. Stephanie's contribution to the escalation involved recruiting female students to participate in more subtle forms of psychological harassment. She had convinced several girls to engage in behaviors designed to undermine Sarah's authority while appearing to be normal teenage social interaction. These recruits would ignore direct instructions, respond to requests with exaggerated confusion, and engage in whispered conversations that included Sarah's name delivered just loudly enough for her to hear fragments that suggested negative discussion of her competence and appearance. The recruitment of additional participants served multiple strategic purposes for Brandon's group. It distributed responsibility among more people, making individual accountability more difficult to establish. It created the appearance of widespread student dissatisfaction with Sarah's teaching rather than coordinated harassment by a small group. Most importantly, it increased the psychological pressure by suggesting that her problems extended beyond 3 problematic students to include significant portions of the student body. Lunch period brought the most serious escalation yet when Sarah discovered that someone had accessed her personal vehicle during school hours. Nothing had been stolen, but items in her car had been rearranged in ways that made clear someone had conducted a thorough search of her personal belongings. More disturbing was the discovery of a small recording device placed under her driver's seat, suggesting that her private conversations were being monitored and potentially recorded for later use against her. The vehicle intrusion represented a clear criminal act that crossed legal boundaries regardless of the perpetrator's ages. However, the sophistication of the operation gaining access to a locked vehicle without leaving evidence of forced entry suggested either advanced technical skills or adult assistance that elevated the harassment beyond what typical high school students could accomplish independently. The recording device was of professional quality rather than simple consumer electronics, implying significant financial resources and technical expertise. Sarah's discovery of the surveillance equipment forced her to confront the possibility that her apartment might also be under observation. A careful inspection of her living space revealed additional evidence of intrusion. Personal items had been moved slightly. Mail had been disturbed, and there were signs that someone had attempted to access her home computer system. The realization that her private sanctuary had been violated created a level of psychological distress that made normal functioning increasingly difficult. Systematic violation of her privacy extended beyond mere harassment into criminal stalking that posed genuine threats to her personal safety. The sophistication of the surveillance operation suggested that whoever was behind it possessed both the technical capabilities and financial resources to conduct professional-level espionage against a substitute teacher, raising serious questions about the true scope and purpose of the campaign being waged against her. The third period on Monday brought the culmination of the escalation phase when Brandon announced to the class that he had prepared a special presentation about substitute teacher qualifications that he wanted to share with everyone. His theatrical enthusiasm and the anticipatory excitement displayed by his associates made clear that this was intended to be the climactic moment of their harassment campaign, designed to achieve total humiliation and drive Sarah away from Lincoln Valley High School permanently. The setup for Brandon's presentation involved elaborate preparations that had clearly been planned over the weekend. He had created what appeared to be a legitimate educational slideshow complete with official-looking graphics, statistical data, and professional formatting that would make it seem like genuine academic research to casual observers. However, the content was specifically designed to question Sarah's qualifications, competence, and right to be in a classroom while maintaining enough educational veneer to appear appropriate for a class presentation. Stephanie's role in the presentation setup involved coordinating documentation of Sarah's expected response through multiple recording devices positioned strategically throughout the classroom. Several students had been instructed to capture video from different angles, ensuring that whatever humiliation they achieved would be preserved for later sharing across social media platforms. The planned documentation revealed their intent to use Sarah's reaction as entertainment content for broader distribution beyond the immediate classroom audience. Derek had recruited additional audience members by spreading word throughout the school that something significant was going to happen during the third period. Students who weren't enrolled in the class had found excuses to be present in the hallway where they could observe through the doorway, while others had arranged to deliver messages or complete errands that would bring them past room 142 during the presentation. The expanded audience was designed to maximize the humiliation, while providing witnesses who could spread accounts of Sarah's expected defeat throughout the school community. The psychological pressure of the moment was intensified by Sarah's growing awareness that traditional educational responses had proven completely inadequate for addressing the sophisticated harassment campaign she faced. Every attempt to work within institutional frameworks had been neutralized or turned against her, while the escalation had continued relentlessly toward this climactic confrontation. Her professional training had prepared her for typical classroom challenges but offered no guidance for dealing with coordinated criminal harassment designed to destroy her career and personal safety. As Brandon prepared to begin his presentation, Sarah realized that she had reached the point where protecting herself and maintaining any semblance of an educational environment would require abandoning the passive responses that had characterized her approach throughout the harassment campaign. The failure of administrative intervention, legal remedies, and professional strategies had created a situation where more direct action might be the only remaining option for preventing complete destruction of her career and personal well-being. Classroom fell into an expectant silence as Brandon Hayes positioned himself at the front of room 142, his laptop connected to the smartboard and his presentation cued for what he clearly intended to be Sarah Mitchell's professional execution. The anticipatory energy was palpable. Students throughout the room leaned forward in their seats. Phones were discreetly positioned for recording, and even Ashley Chun had stopped her nervous fidgeting to watch what everyone sensed would be a defining moment. Before we continue with today's regular lesson, Brandon announced with theatrical authority, "I think it's important that we address some concerns that have come to my attention about the qualifications of our current instructor." His voice carried the confident tone of someone who had never faced meaningful consequences for his actions, and his smile suggested genuine excitement about the humiliation he was about to unleash. Sarah remained standing beside her desk, her posture calm and her expression neutral, but years of Krav Maga training had already triggered subtle physiological changes that prepared her body for confrontation. Her breathing had become more controlled. Her stance had shifted imperceptibly to provide better balance and mobility, and her awareness had expanded to encompass every person and potential threat within the classroom environment. To casual observers, she appeared unchanged, but her grandmother's training had awakened instincts that were far more ancient and reliable than educational protocols. Stephanie Walsh had positioned herself strategically near the classroom door, her role clearly to manage the expanded audience that Derek had recruited from throughout the school. Several students who weren't enrolled in the class lingered in the hallway, while others had found pretext to be present in the room during what everyone expected to be the climactic confrontation. The coordination was sophisticated and thorough, Designed to ensure maximum visibility for Sarah's anticipated humiliation, Derek Novak held his phone in position to capture multiple angles of the presentation, his excitement barely contained. As he anticipated documenting what he believed would be their greatest victory against a substitute teacher, his nervous energy was more pronounced than usual, suggesting that he understood the significance of this moment for his standing within Brandon's inner circle and his desperate need to prove his value to the group. "I've prepared a comprehensive analysis," Brandon continued, advancing the first slide of his presentation, "examining the qualifications required for effective education versus what we've observed from our current substitute." The slide displayed professionally formatted graphics comparing teaching credentials, experience levels, and student satisfaction ratings, all fabricated, but designed to appear legitimate to anyone not examining the details closely. The presentation represented weeks of preparation and significant resources invested in creating content sophisticated enough to appear credible while being specifically designed to destroy Sarah's professional reputation. Someone had researched actual educational standards, created convincing statistical comparisons, and even incorporated what appeared to be testimonials from other schools where Sarah had worked. The level of detail and professional presentation quality suggested either exceptional student capabilities or adult assistance in creating the materials. "As you can see from this data," Brandon explained, clicking to a slide filled with charts and graphs, "there are significant concerns about whether our substitute meets the standards we deserve as Lincoln Valley students. The evidence suggests that we're being shortchanged in our educational experience by someone who may not possess the qualifications necessary for effective instruction." Sarah recognized that the moment had arrived when years of restraint and professional protocols would either save or destroy her career. Brandon's presentation was carefully crafted to appear legitimate, while being designed for maximum damage to her reputation and livelihood. The recorded documentation would ensure that whatever response she made would be preserved and potentially shared throughout the educational community, making this confrontation a defining moment that would affect her professional future regardless of how she chose to handle it. The psychological pressure was immense and deliberately constructed. Brandon had created a scenario where any response Sarah made could be twisted against her defending herself, would appear defensive and unprofessional, while remaining silent would be interpreted as admission of the accusations being leveled against her. The sophistication of the trap revealed months of planning and a deep understanding of how to manipulate institutional dynamics and social media to maximum advantage. Furthermore, Brandon continued, advancing to another fabricated slide, "I've gathered testimony from students at other schools where this substitute has worked, and the pattern is quite concerning." The slide displayed what appeared to be negative evaluations and complaints from previous assignments, all fictitious, but presented with enough detail to seem credible to anyone not investigating their authenticity. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that always preceded moments of decisive action, but this time it was tempered by years of training that had taught her to channel physiological arousal into precise, controlled responses rather than emotional reactions. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "True strength is knowing when to act and when to restrain yourself. The greatest victories come from using exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right moment." The breaking point arrived when Brandon clicked to his final slide, a photograph of Sarah that had been digitally manipulated to place her in compromising situations with fabricated quotes attributed to her about her teaching philosophy and personal beliefs. The image was clearly designed for maximum humiliation and would cause irreparable damage to her professional reputation if allowed to circulate through social media and educational networks. "As you can see," Brandon said with undisguised satisfaction, "we have significant evidence that our substitute teacher has been less than honest about her qualifications and intentions. I think it's time we address these concerns directly and demanded better for our educational experience." The silence that followed was pregnant with anticipation as everyone waited for Sarah's response to what was clearly intended to be the final blow in a comprehensive character assassination campaign. Brandon's confidence was absolute. He had created what appeared to be an impossible situation, where any response Sarah made would only add to her humiliation and professional destruction. Instead of the defensive reaction Brandon expected, Sarah stepped forward with fluid grace and spoke in a voice that carried quiet authority strengthened by years of facing genuinely dangerous situations. "Brandon, that's an impressive presentation. It shows remarkable creativity and significant investment of time and resources. However, there are several problems with using fabricated evidence to support false accusations." Her response was measured and professional, but there was an undertone of steel that hadn't been present in her previous interactions with the class. Students throughout the room sensed the change in atmosphere, though most couldn't identify exactly what had shifted in Sarah's demeanor. Years of training had taught her to project calm confidence, even while preparing for decisive action, and that preparation was becoming visible to anyone observant enough to notice. "I'm not sure what you mean by fabricated," Brandon replied, his confidence wavering slightly as he sensed that Sarah's response wasn't following the script he had anticipated. "This is all legitimate research about educational standards and previous performance evaluations." Sarah advanced slowly toward the front of the classroom, her movement controlled and purposeful in ways that suggested military or martial arts training to anyone familiar with such disciplines. "Brandon, I'm going to give you one opportunity to end this presentation voluntarily and apologize to the class for attempting to present falsified information as legitimate academic research." The offer was delivered with quiet authority that made clear it was not a negotiation, but a final warning before more decisive action would be taken. Students throughout the room recognized that something fundamental had changed in the dynamic, though most couldn't identify exactly what was different about their substitute teacher's presence and bearing. Brandon's response revealed his complete misunderstanding of the situation he had created. Rather than recognizing the warning implicit in Sarah's offer, he interpreted her measured response as evidence of weakness and an invitation to escalate his attack further. "I don't think you're in a position to make demands," he said with renewed confidence. "The evidence speaks for itself, and I think everyone here deserves to know the truth about who's been teaching them." His decision to continue the attack triggered responses that Sarah had spent years training, but had hoped never to need in an educational environment. The transition from educator to tactical operator was instantaneous and complete, though invisible to observers who didn't understand the significance of subtle changes in stance, breathing, and spatial awareness that indicated preparation for decisive action. "Brandon, you have 5 seconds to turn off that presentation and sit down," Sarah said with absolute calm that carried more authority than shouting could have achieved. "This is your final opportunity to resolve this situation through conversation, rather than other means." The countdown was delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that experienced combatants recognize as indicating genuine rather than bluffed consequences. Students throughout the room felt the shift in atmosphere even if they couldn't identify its source, while Brandon's confidence began to waver as he finally sensed that his substitute teacher was not reacting according to his carefully planned script. Instead of compliance, Brandon made the fatal decision to escalate further by advancing the presentation to display additional fabricated materials while beckoning Stephanie and Derek to join him at the front of the classroom for what he envisioned as a triumphant group confrontation. "I think we should discuss these concerns as a class," he announced. "Everyone deserves to participate in evaluating our educational experience." The invitation for group participation was intended to create an overwhelming social dynamic that would force Sarah into complete submission through public humiliation witnessed and recorded by dozens of students. Brandon's fundamental miscalculation was assuming that his substitute teacher would continue responding through educational protocols rather than drawing upon entirely different skill sets that her background had developed. Sarah's response was swift, precise, and completely unexpected by everyone present in room 142. In one fluid motion, she moved to the smartboard, disconnected Brandon's laptop, and placed it securely on her desk where it could no longer be used to display fabricated materials. The movement was executed with such speed and precision that most observers didn't immediately understand what had happened. "The presentation is over," Sarah announced with calm finality. "Brandon, Stephanie, and Derek, you will return to your seats immediately, or I will escort you there personally. This classroom will return to its educational function now." Brandon's shock at having his elaborate presentation terminated so decisively was quickly replaced by anger at being publicly thwarted after investing so much preparation into what he had expected to be his greatest victory. His response revealed the depth of his miscalculation about the person he had chosen to target. "You can't just take my property," he protested, reaching toward the laptop in an attempt to regain control of his presentation. "I have the right to complete my research presentation, and you have no authority to censor legitimate academic discussion." His decision to physically reach for the laptop while advancing aggressively toward Sarah triggered responses that years of tactical training had made instinctive and inevitable. The moment Brandon's hand moved toward her or her secured position, every defensive protocol she had ever learned activated simultaneously. The neutralization was executed with textbook precision that would have impressed her former instructors. Sarah intercepted Brandon's reaching motion, redirected his momentum using his own aggressive energy, and applied a controlled wrist lock that brought him to his knees facing away from her in less than 3 seconds. The technique was applied with exactly enough pressure to control his movement without causing injury, demonstrating the kind of precise force application that required years of training to master. "Brandon Hayes," Sarah said in a voice that carried absolute authority while maintaining perfect calm, "you will not touch me, my property, or anything in this classroom without permission. You will not continue your harassment campaign, and you will treat me and every other educator with the respect that our profession deserves. Do you understand me?" The transformation was complete and undeniable. The quiet substitute teacher who had absorbed weeks of harassment while maintaining professional composure had revealed capabilities that no one in room 142 had imagined possible. Brandon's position on his knees with his wrist controlled by someone half his size created a visual demonstration of power reversal that was immediately understood by every person present. Stephanie Walsh stood frozen with her mouth open. Her carefully planned role in the climactic confrontation rendered irrelevant by the swift termination of their operation. Derek Novak's phone continued recording, but his expression revealed shock rather than excitement as he realized that their greatest planned victory had become their most complete defeat. The silence in room 142 was absolute as 30 students processed the complete reversal of power dynamics they had just witnessed. Ashley Chun's expression showed relief mixed with amazement, while Marcus Thompson nodded with what appeared to be approval of seeing justice finally delivered to people who had terror as substitute teachers throughout their high school careers. "Now," Sarah continued, maintaining her controlled hold on Brandon while addressing the rest of the class, "we're going to have a discussion about respect, appropriate behavior, and the consequences of harassment. Brandon is going to lead that discussion by explaining to everyone what he's learned about the difference between educational discourse and criminal harassment." The lesson had begun in earnest, though it bore no resemblance to anything in Mrs. Garrett's carefully prepared curriculum materials. The aftermath of Brandon's neutralization unfolded with the kind of swift administrative response that Sarah had been unable to achieve through weeks of formal complaints and proper channels. Within minutes of Derek's panicked call to the main office, Principal Stevens arrived at room 142, to find a completely transformed classroom dynamic that challenged everything he thought he understood about the situation. Brandon Hayes remained seated at his desk, his wrist showing no signs of injury, but his demeanor completely altered from the confident aggressor who had initiated the confrontation. The elaborate presentation materials lay scattered around the smartboard area, while Sarah stood calmly beside her desk with the kind of composed authority that comes from successfully defending oneself against coordinated attack. Most significantly, every student in the classroom was sitting quietly with expressions that ranged from stunned amazement to obvious relief. "What exactly happened here?" Principal Stevens asked, his tone suggesting he expected to address another routine classroom management issue rather than the culmination of a weeks-long harassment campaign that had finally been resolved through decisive action. Ashley Chun, who had remained silent throughout weeks of witnessing Brandon's increasingly aggressive behavior, found her voice for the first time. "Mr. Stevens, Brandon has been harassing Ms. Mitchell since she started working here. Today he tried to humiliate her with a fake presentation full of lies about her qualifications. When she told him to stop, he tried to grab her, and she defended herself." The simple statement carried more weight than weeks of formal complaints, because it came from a student witness rather than the targeted educator. Principal Stevens looked around the classroom and saw nods of agreement from multiple students, who had previously remained silent about Brandon's behavior patterns, creating a consensus that was impossible to dismiss or explain away through alternative interpretations. Marcus Thompson, another student who had carefully avoided involvement in classroom conflicts, spoke up to provide additional context. She gave him multiple warnings to stop the presentation and sit down. He chose to keep going and then tried to take her property. She only did what she had to do to protect herself. The student testimonies created a narrative that Principal Stevens could not ignore or reframe according to his preferred approach of avoiding conflicts with influential families. Multiple witnesses were providing consistent accounts that clearly established Brandon as the aggressor and Sarah as someone who had defended herself only after exhausting all other options for resolving the situation peacefully. Derek Novak's phone recording, which he had intended to use for mocking Sarah's anticipated humiliation, instead provided undeniable evidence of Brandon's harassment campaign and Sarah's measured response. The video clearly showed Brandon's aggressive advance toward Sarah, his attempt to regain control of materials she had secured, and her precise defensive action that used minimal force to neutralize his aggression without causing injury. Stephanie Walsh, who had spent weeks orchestrating psychological harassment campaigns, found herself unable to provide any defense for Brandon's behavior or explanation for their group's activities that didn't implicate them in systematic harassment. Her carefully constructed social influence evaporated when confronted with evidence of coordinated criminal behavior that could no longer be disguised as innocent teenage pranks or legitimate academic discourse. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the harassment campaign that Brandon's group had conducted against Sarah and previous substitute teachers. School administrators discovered the fake social media accounts, the coordinated surveillance activities, the vehicle intrusion, and the systematic reputation destruction efforts that had characterized their operation. The sophistication of their activities had crossed multiple legal boundaries and created liability issues for the school district that made decisive action unavoidable. Robert Hayes arrived at Lincoln Valley High School within an hour of being notified about his son's situation, but his usual ability to negotiate favorable outcomes for Brandon was severely compromised by the undeniable evidence of criminal harassment and the public nature of the confrontation. Multiple students had recorded Brandon's behavior and Sarah's defensive response, creating documentation that made traditional damage control strategies impossible to implement effectively. The legal consequences began accumulating rapidly as the full scope of Brandon's harassment campaign became clear through digital forensics investigation. The fake social media accounts violated identity theft statutes. The vehicle intrusion constituted breaking and entering. The surveillance equipment represented illegal wiretapping. And the coordinated harassment campaign met federal cyberstalking. Criteria that elevated the charges beyond simple school disciplinary issues. Stephanie Walsh's family faced similar legal exposure when investigators discovered her role in organizing the reputation, destruction campaign, and coordinating the psychological harassment tactics that had systematically targeted multiple substitute teachers over several years. Her father's position as a major school district donor provided no protection against criminal charges that had attracted media attention and created public relations problems for everyone associated with enabling the harassment. Derek Novak's desperate attempt to maintain his social status by participating in increasingly serious criminal activities resulted in consequences that his middle-class family was far less equipped to handle than the wealthy families of his former associates. His documentation of the harassment campaign provided prosecutors with extensive evidence, while his cooperation in the investigation became his only viable strategy for avoiding the most serious charges. The school district's response reflected both legal necessity and genuine recognition that their previous approaches to handling influential students had created systemic problems that required comprehensive reform. Principal Stevens was reassigned to administrative duties, pending a full review of his handling of harassment complaints, while new policies were implemented requiring immediate investigation of any harassment allegations, regardless of the social status or family connections of the accused students. Sarah's position at Lincoln Valley High School was transformed overnight from temporary substitute to permanent faculty member when Mrs. Garrett announced her decision to take early retirement. Rather than return to a classroom where she had lost confidence and administrative support for maintaining educational standards, the school board's offer of a full-time position came with formal apologies for the harassment she had endured and guarantees of administrative backing for future classroom management decisions. The broader impact on Lincoln Valley's school culture was immediate and profound. Students who had previously felt powerless to challenge Brandon's influence found their voices and began reporting other instances of harassment and intimidation that had been tolerated under the previous social order. The systematic documentation of abuse patterns revealed that Brandon's group had victimized dozens of substitute teachers, student peers, and even some permanent faculty members over several years. Ashley Chun emerged as an unexpected leader in the cultural transformation, organizing student support groups for harassment victims and advocating for stronger protective policies throughout the district. Her courage in speaking up during the confrontation inspired other students to challenge toxic social dynamics that had previously seemed unchangeable, creating momentum for sustained improvement in the school environment. Marcus Thompson joined Ashley in establishing peer mentorship programs designed to support substitute teachers and new students who might be vulnerable to harassment campaigns. Their initiative gained support from faculty and administration who recognized the value of student-led efforts to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had characterized Brandon's reign over the school's social hierarchy. The academic impact was equally significant as classroom environments throughout Lincoln Valley improved dramatically once students understood that harassment campaigns would face meaningful consequences rather than administrative accommodation. Teachers reported increased engagement, improved behavior, and renewed focus on educational objectives when toxic social dynamics were removed from their classrooms. Sarah's reputation within the educational community was transformed from that of a struggling substitute teacher to a respected professional who had successfully confronted systematic harassment while maintaining her commitment to educational excellence. Her experience became a case study in educational leadership programs, demonstrating how appropriate defensive action could protect both individual educators and institutional integrity when traditional approaches proved inadequate. The legal Proceedings that followed established important precedents for addressing student harassment of educational personnel. Brandon's conviction on federal cyberstalking charges sent a clear message throughout the educational community that sophisticated harassment campaigns would face serious consequences, regardless of the perpetrator's family connections or social influence. The case became required reading in educational law courses and professional development programs for school administrators. Stephanie's conviction for conspiracy and identity theft resulted in significant community service requirements, focused on education about cyberbullying and harassment prevention. Her mandatory participation in victim impact programs provided direct confrontation with the consequences of her actions while contributing to prevention efforts that could protect future potential victims from similar systematic abuse. Derek's cooperation with law enforcement and genuine remorse for his participation in the harassment campaign earned him reduced charges but also required extensive counseling and community service designed to address the insecurities that had made him vulnerable to manipulation by more dominant personalities. His experience became part of educational programs about peer pressure and the importance of moral courage in challenging group dynamics. The 3-year investigation that followed revealed similar harassment patterns at multiple schools throughout the region, leading to systemic reforms in how educational institutions address reports of educator harassment and student misconduct. Sarah's decisive action had triggered reforms that protected hundreds of current and future educators from the kind of systematic abuse that had previously been tolerated as an inevitable occupational hazard. Sarah's continuing career at Lincoln Valley High School flourished as she developed innovative approaches to classroom management that combined educational excellence with the kind of quiet authority that comes from genuine confidence in one's ability to handle challenging situations. Her students consistently achieved high academic performance while developing respect for educators and understanding of appropriate social dynamics. Her evening self-defense classes at the Riverside Community Center expanded significantly as word spread about her experience and capabilities. The program evolved to include specific training for educators facing workplace harassment, providing practical skills while emphasizing the importance of appropriate response levels and legal considerations that must guide professional conduct. In educational environments, the transformation of Lincoln Valley High School became a model for other institutions struggling with similar challenges involving student harassment of educational personnel. The case demonstrated that decisive action by trained professionals could resolve systemic problems that traditional administrative approaches had failed to address effectively, while maintaining commitment to educational objectives and appropriate use of force. Sarah's grandmother's wisdom about the difference between strength and aggression had proven prophetic in ways that neither of them could have anticipated when those lessons were first taught. True strength had indeed been demonstrated through knowing when to act and when to restrain herself, using exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right moment to protect not only herself, but also the educational environment that every student deserved. The legacy of those 45 seconds in room 142 continued to influence educational policy, legal precedent, and cultural expectations throughout the region for years to come. What began as a systematic harassment campaign designed to drive away another substitute teacher had instead become a defining moment that transformed how educational institutions understand their responsibility to protect educators while maintaining environments where genuine learning can flourish for every student. The media attention that followed the Lincoln Valley incident created a national conversation about student harassment of educators and the institutional failures that had allowed such systematic abuse to flourish unchecked. Sarah's story was featured in educational journals, news programs, and documentary films that examined the broader crisis of educator harassment in American schools. Her measured response and the decisive way she had protected herself while maintaining educational objectives became a template for professional development programs across the country. The documentary, Breaking Point: When Educators Fight Back, premiered 2 years after the incident and featured extensive interviews with Sarah, the reformed students, and educational experts who analyzed the systematic failures that had enabled Brandon's harassment campaign. The film's impact extended beyond the educational community to influence workplace harassment policies in corporate environments, where similar power dynamics had been exploited by individuals with institutional protection. Sarah's book, Strength in Restraint: Finding Your Voice in Toxic Environments, became required reading in education programs throughout the United States and internationally. The memoir detailed not only her experience at Lincoln Valley, but also provided practical guidance for educators facing systematic harassment while maintaining their commitment to educational excellence. The proceeds were donated to programs supporting harassed educators and establishing legal defense funds for teachers facing similar challenges. The Brandon Hayes case became a landmark legal precedent that was cited in hundreds of subsequent harassment prosecutions throughout the country. Legal scholars analyzed the case as a demonstration of how systematic harassment campaigns using social media and digital surveillance could be successfully prosecuted under existing cyberstalking statutes, providing prosecutors with effective tools for addressing similar cases involving institutional power imbalances. 5 years after the Cote incident, Lincoln Valley High School had become a model institution studied by educational researchers from universities worldwide. The cultural transformation that began with Sarah's defensive action had evolved into comprehensive reforms that addressed not only harassment prevention but also positive character development, peer support systems, and restorative justice approaches to disciplinary issues that emphasized accountability while maintaining educational objectives. Brandon Hayes, upon completing his legal obligations and extensive counseling programs, had evolved into an unexpected advocate for harassment prevention. His presentations to high school students about the consequences of systematic harassment and the importance of moral courage in challenging toxic social dynamics carried particular weight because of his personal experience with both perpetrating and facing consequences for such behavior. His transformation provided hope that even the most problematic individuals could develop genuine understanding of their impact on others. Stephanie Walsh had channeled her organizational skills and understanding of social dynamics into positive contributions through her work with nonprofit organizations focused on cyberbullying prevention. Her intimate knowledge of how harassment campaigns were constructed and executed made her uniquely qualified to help potential victims recognize warning signs and develop protective strategies before situations escalated to crisis levels. Derek Novak's journey toward understanding his role in the harassment campaign led him to pursue a career in counseling, specializing in helping adolescents develop authentic self-confidence rather than seeking validation through association with dominant personalities. His personal experience with both perpetrating and being victimized by social manipulation provided him with insights that proved valuable in helping other young people navigate complex social dynamics without compromising their moral principles. Ripple effects of Sarah's 45 seconds of decisive action continued, expanding throughout the educational community for decades, demonstrating how individual courage in the face of systematic harassment could catalyze transformative changes that protected countless future educators and students. The Lincoln Valley incident had become more than a story of personal triumph. It had evolved into a symbol of how institutional change could emerge from individual acts of appropriate self-defense when all other systems had failed. Ashley Chun's evolution from silent witness to student advocate had launched a career in educational policy reform that took her to the state legislature, where she championed laws requiring immediate investigation of harassment complaints and providing legal protections for educators facing systematic abuse. Her legislation became known as the Lincoln Valley Act, and was adopted by educational systems throughout the country as a model for protecting educational personnel. Marcus Thompson's peer mentorship programs had expanded into a national nonprofit organization that provided training and support for students who wanted to challenge toxic social dynamics in their schools. His organization's success demonstrated that cultural change could be sustained through student leadership when proper institutional support was provided for positive behavioral alternatives. The 10-year anniversary of the incident was marked by a conference at Lincoln Valley High School that brought together educators, legal experts, students, and policymakers to discuss progress in addressing systematic harassment in educational environments. Sarah delivered the keynote address, reflecting on how her grandmother's wisdom about appropriate use of strength had proven prophetic in ways that extended far beyond personal protection to encompass institutional transformation and cultural evolution. The legacy of those 45 seconds in room 142 continued to influence educational policy, legal precedent, and cultural expectations throughout the region and beyond for years to come. What began as a systematic harassment campaign designed to drive away another substitute teacher had instead become a defining moment that transformed how educational institutions understand their responsibility to protect educators while maintaining environments where genuine learning can flourish for every student, creating lasting change that would protect countless future generations of both educators and students from the kind of systematic abuse that had once been tolerated as an inevitable part of the educational experience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.